So with this video, we're going to look at the lymphatic system. And the first thing that you should know about this particular system is that it actually consists of two kind of semi-independent parts. The first of these that you should know about has an immune system function. So this includes what are known as lymphoid tissues and organs in the body. If you look at this diagram over here on the far right side of your screen, this diagram is showing where some of these lymphoid tissues and organs are located in the body. So the first of these that I want to point out are the tonsils. There are several of these. You're probably most familiar with the palatine tonsils that you can actually see if you open your mouth really wide. But there are actually several different types of tonsils, not all of which are visible, and they form a ring of lymphatic tissue that kind of surrounds the back of the throat. The reason for this is a lot of the germs, the viruses, the bacteria that we get exposed to enter the body either through the nose or through the mouth. And lymphatic tissue contains a lot of immune system cells such as macrophages and lymphocytes. And so that's a really good place to have lymphoid tissue that contains these cells surrounding the throat where you're going to have exposure to so many viruses and bacteria. If you go down here, this is represented in green. We've got a lymphatic tissue or organ, which is known as the thymus. It kind of overlies the heart. It's large in children and it's functioning in children. By the time you're 30 or 40 years old, it really has atrophied and become just a piece of connective tissue that's kind of overlying the heart and has lost much of its function. However, when we're young, this is a place where a lot of T cells develop, and T cells are one of the cells of the immune system. And so that's why the thymus is considered to be a lymphatic organ, because it houses these cells that are developing that will eventually become part of the immune system. Down in here, you can see the spleen. So that has an immune system function as well. For that reason, it's considered to be a lymphoid organ. And then you may or may not be able to see, we've got the intestines down here. And there are some microscopic structures located in the intestines, which are known as Peyer's patches, that also house immune system cells and help to keep the body healthy from microorganisms that could be in the gut that could be potentially harmful to you. So these are our lymphoid tissues and organs. You'll have a chance to learn more about them when we get into the immune system, which is where we're going to go after the lymphatic system. But they are considered to be a part of this lymphatic system because they're playing a role in immunity. The other kind of semi-independent part of the lymphatic system are what are known as lymphatic vessels. So if you look at this picture here of this cartoon representation, we've got somebody that's standing in anatomical position, and you'll notice we've got these kind of black lines that are running all throughout this person's body. If you didn't know, they would almost seem like they look like blood vessels, and they do in fact have a structure that's very, very similar to veins. But these are the lymphatic vessels, and the role of the lymphatic vessels is to transport fluids that have leaked out of the capillaries. They've leaked from the vascular system, from the blood, and they build up in tissues. And so it's really important because if you think about capillaries, especially the sinusoidal and the fenestrated capillaries are really quite leaky, and they tend to leak a lot of fluids and proteins from the blood into the tissues of the body. So we've got to have a way to gather those fluids and those proteins that were leaked from the blood and get them back into the blood. Otherwise, you would really quickly lose a very high volume of fluids from the blood. So those fluids and those proteins that are leaked from the blood, from the capillaries into the tissues are what are known as lymph, and lymphatic vessels are the vessels, the system that's going to help to pick that lymph back up and get it back into the bloodstream where it can help to maintain fluid volume and those kinds of things. So we always find in any A&P class and any A&P text, the lymphatic system being taught in between the cardiovascular system and the immune system, because it's really kind of a bridge between these two systems. It's got this function that's helping the cardiovascular system to work in the case of the lymphatic vessels that are picking up the lymph, the fluids and the proteins that are leaked from the cardiovascular system. But it also plays a role in immunity as well through these lymphoid and tissues and organs that we have spread throughout the body. So the first thing that I want to do as we continue with this lecture is talk a little bit about these lymphatic vessels. So if you look over here, we've got, again, a person that's standing in anatomical position, and you'll notice that we have these vessel-like structures that are located all throughout their bodies. So this is, again, an artist's representation of the lymphatic vessels. Very often when you see cartoon representations of this particular system, the lymphatic vessels will be represented in green, and that will help you to be able to differentiate them from blood vessels, which, as you know, are represented typically in blue or red. So I want to talk a little bit about these lymphatic vessels and specifically about the structure of the different types of lymphatic vessels. They vary in size quite a bit. So we've got lymphatic vessels that are really just about the size of capillaries. They're teeny tiny, all the way up to lymphatic vessels that are really quite large and are more comparable in size to the largest veins in the body. So what I want to do is talk about each of these different types of lymphatic vessels, starting with the smallest ones and kind of working our way up. The smallest of the lymphatic vessels are what are known as the lymphatic capillaries. So I want you to focus for a minute on this diagram down here. We have a capillary bed. So here's our capillary bed, and you guys know at this point kind of the structure of capillary beds. And that blood's going to enter them, and it's going to give up its oxygen and nutrients to the tissues of the body while the blood's in the capillaries. But you've also learned that capillaries in many cases tend to be quite porous. And because of that, it's not just oxygen and nutrients that are leaving the bloodstream in a lot of cases, but we also have a lot of fluids that are leaking out of the capillaries in this particular area. And in addition to that, proteins as well. And again, that fluid plus the proteins makes up the lymph. So if it weren't for the fact that we have these lymphatic capillaries kind of interspersed with the capillary beds, again, you can see them here represented in green, then we would have a situation where we'd have a lot of fluids being leaked from the blood and capillary beds and really no good way to pick up all those fluids. So the good way that we have to be able to pick up those fluids is just having these capillaries kind of interspersed throughout the bed. And I want to show you a little bit the structure of the tip of a lymphatic capillary. So if you look at this picture down here, the one that's just below the capillary bed, you'll notice we've got the tip of one of these lymphatic capillaries. And one of the things that I want you to notice about it in particular is it has this structure, which is known as a flap-like mini valve. So I'm going to draw an arrow right here that's pointing at that flap-like mini valve. And this flap-like mini valve allows basically the entire wall of that lymphatic capillary to open up, which makes lymphatic capillaries tremendously porous. They will absorb the fluids, they will absorb the proteins, they are even able to absorb things as large as cells that get introduced into tissues because of these flap-like mini valves that open up. So I'm going to draw a picture over here so maybe you can understand a little bit how these structures work. So here is my representation of the wall of a capillary, a lymphatic capillary. Here's that flap-like mini valve open, okay? And then here's the rest of the wall of that capillary. And when that flap-like mini valve opens, now we have this big space. We've basically taken out the wall of that lymphatic capillary, and anything that's in the tissues is able to flow through that opening, through where that flap-like mini valve opened up and into the lymphatic capillary. So again, the fluids that are leaked from the blood, the proteins that are leaked from the blood are able to very easily make their way from the tissues into these lymphatic capillaries. But anything else that has been introduced into the tissues as well, such as a virus, such as a bacterium, is also going to get picked up because basically the entire wall of that capillary opens up and it allows a very, very large space for things to be able to make their way into the lymphatic capillaries. So for example, if you were to get a cat bite, cats have notoriously dirty mouths, you're probably going to get some bacteria, some viruses introduced under the skin with that cat bite. And then what's going to happen is that bacteria, because it can fit, those viruses, because they can fit, are going to get sucked up into the lymphatic capillary, and they are going to get transported through these lymphatic vessels and eventually make their way into the blood. When you get a bacterial infection in the blood, this is a condition that's known as sepsis, and it's really dangerous. And the reason for that is bacteria, a lot of them, when they metabolize, they make a chemical that's a vasodilator. And as you guys have learned, vasodilators tend to really severely drop blood pressure, at least if you have vasodilation going on all throughout the body, which is one of the situations that you would have with sepsis. So if you were to get a bacteria that traveled through the lymphatic system, remember the role of the lymphatic vessels is to transport all of that fluid, the lymph, and anything else that's contained within it into the blood. Then you could end up with a bacterial infection in the blood, which is really problematic. To prevent this, we have lymph nodes. So these are little structures that are located along some of the lymphatic vessels, and their role is to clean the lymph. Their role is to clean these fluids and proteins that were leaked from the blood, as well as anything else that got picked up by lymphatic capillaries, so viruses and bacteria, and get that stuff out of the lymph before it gets deposited back into the bloodstream. These lymph nodes are found along our next largest type of lymphatic vessel, which is known as a lymphatic collecting vessel. So down here, we talked about these lymphatic capillaries, the fact that they're about the size of blood capillaries. They're kind of intertwined with these capillary beds. If you look at this picture over here, we've got a capillary bed, we've got some of these lymphatic capillaries coming off of it, where we've got a whole bunch of lymphatic capillaries joining together, which is through this area here. Now we're in the next larger type of lymphatic vessel, which is the lymphatic collecting vessels. And if you look at this picture here, you can actually see a couple of lymph nodes that are interspersed along these lymphatic collecting vessels. If you go to the picture that we have over here, most of these vessels that you can see through the legs, also up in here through the arms, are lymphatic collecting vessels. This is the only type of lymphatic vessel that has the lymph nodes interspersed along them. And you can see those collections of lymph nodes. So there's a lot of them down here in the inguinal region. There's a lot of them up here in the axillary region in the armpit. And we've got a pretty high density of lymph nodes kind of in the cervical region as well. So this is kind of below your jaw. If you've ever gone to the doctor, and a lot of times they'll feel like under your neck if you're sick, what they're feeling for is lymph nodes, because a lot of times if there is a bacterial infection in the body or other infection in the body, these particular nodes will become swollen, and it's something that you can palpate. It's something that you can feel on the outside of the body. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about lymph nodes with the next slide and talk a little bit about how they're actually able to clean these things that have been introduced into the body out of the lymph so that we don't have, for example, bacteria making their way into the bloodstream. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about the last two types of lymphatic vessels and just briefly mention them. So if you look right here, we have an area where a whole bunch of lymphatic collecting vessels are coming together to form a vessel through here. So where we have lymphatic collecting vessels coming together, we have what are known as lymphatic trunks. And where lymphatic trunks come together, they flow into the largest type of lymphatic vessel, which is known as a lymphatic duct. So you can see the thoracic duct here. It comes up, goes behind the heart, and then it's actually going to deposit the lymph, which at this point hopefully has been cleaned, and usually is. It's not carrying bacteria and viruses and those kinds of things. But that lymph is going to be deposited back into the vascular system right here, into the subclavian vein, kind of at the junction where it comes together with the internal jugular. Everybody has a thoracic duct that's draining fluid from the left side of their body and also the lower body as well. Some of us have what's known as the right lymphatic duct. So this diagram actually shows it. You can see it right here. The right lymphatic duct, if it's present, drains into the subclavian on the other side, so left subclavian, right subclavian, where it's coming together with the internal jugular on that side. If you do have a right lymphatic duct, it's going to be draining lymph from the right upper part of the body. If you don't have a right lymphatic duct, you wouldn't know. It's not going to cause you problems. All of your lymph in that case, including the lymph that's coming back from the right side of the body, is going to be drained through the thoracic duct. So we've got one last slide with this particular lecture, and with this slide I wanted to talk just about the structure of lymph nodes. If you look at this picture over here, what we've got is a lymph node that's been cut longitudinally so that you can see the internal structure of it. And I want to use this particular slide to talk about how the structure of a lymph node allows it to be really, really good at clearing bacteria and other harmful things that have been introduced to the lymph from the lymph before that lymph gets deposited back into the bloodstream. So remember that you find these lymph nodes kind of interspersed along those lymphatic collecting ducts, and lymph, as it's moving through the lymphatic collecting ducts, is going to go through several of these lymph nodes before it flows into the trunks and the ducts and from there into the blood. So we've got a really great system for removing bacteria from the lymph so that bacteria doesn't actually make its way into the bloodstream. So the first thing that I want you to notice as you look at this lymph node is look at these vessels on this side, on this outer portion here of the lymph node. These are what are known as afferent lymphatic vessels. You'll notice there's an arrow that's pointing and showing that lymph moves through these afferent lymphatic vessels in this direction. So our afferent vessels are the ones that are actually bringing the lymph into the lymph node. If you look over here, on this side of our lymph node, we've got a couple of what are known as efferent vessels. And if you look at the arrows coming off of these efferent vessels, they're indicating that efferent vessels are the vessels that are actually taking lymph away from the lymph node. So basically what happens is lymph is going to enter the lymph node here. It has to make its way through the lymph node itself, and then it's going to exit the lymph node through these efferent vessels over here. The first thing that we've got built into a lymph node structurally to make it really, really good at filtering bacteria has to do with these vessels that are bringing lymph into the lymph node and that are taking lymph away from the lymph node. So I want you to notice as you look at this that we have 5 of these vessels, 5 of these afferent vessels that are bringing lymph into the lymph node. If you look over here, we have only 2 efferent vessels that are taking it away. So this is kind of the first thing that we have built into a lymph node to make it really good at filtering. And here's why. I think we're all familiar with what happens when you have 5 lanes on the freeway and then suddenly 3 of them are closed and you go down to only 2 lanes. And that is we get a lot of stagnation of traffic through here, right? And that's why we see far more afferent vessels on lymph nodes than we see efferent vessels. We've got a much higher influx of lymph into the lymph node than we have an efflux of lymph out of the lymph node. And that causes stagnation. That causes a really slow movement of lymph through the lymph node itself. So we really slow down the movement of lymph. We congest it quite a bit. And then inside of this lymph node, we've got these tissues that are just full of immune system cells. So we have B and T cells, which if you're not familiar with them yet, you're going to learn all about them when we get into the immune system. These are immune system cells that are helping to rid the body of things that are in it that are harmful. We've got dendritic cells as well in this particular area, which again, we're going to learn more about when we get into the immune system. But these are cells that are also helping to rid the body from things that are harmful that are located within it. So we've got all of these immune system cells located all throughout here. We've got this lymph that may, in some cases, be carrying bacteria that has to move very slowly through this lymph node. And that gives these B cells and these T cells and these dendritic cells and these macrophages, these other immune system cells that are present in the lymph node, time to really kind of look at the lymph and filter the lymph and take stuff out of it that could be potentially harmful to the body, so things like bacteria. So the lymph node itself is divided into a couple of different areas. I am outlining an area right now that when I get this done, it's going to have kind of a C shape to it. And this area is what's known as the cortex. So all of this out here that's contained within this C-shaped structure that I've just made is what's known as the cortex. And there's a few structures associated with the cortex that you should be familiar with. So the first thing that I want you to notice is we've got these areas in pink. These are actually open spaces through the lymph node. So they're channels that run through the lymph node. Open spaces, this is where lymph is actually going to be flowing through the lymph node itself. They are actually known as sinuses, and in particular, they're called subcapsular sinuses. So this outer tissue here of the lymph node is the capsule. So the subcapsular sinuses are these open spaces, okay, that are just below that capsule. So subcapsular sinuses is the names for them, basically. And if you are lymph and you're entering into a lymph node, you're going to have to make your way through these subcapsular sinuses. You can't just do a straight shot through what's represented in purple here, because these purple structures are follicles. They're actually solid tissue, and that means you can't just move through them if you're lymph. You have to go around them. And in the center of these follicles, we have what are known as germinal centers, which is an area where immune system cells are housed and where they're kind of developing. If you go into this space here, so kind of the middle of the lymph node, if you will, this is what's known as the medulla, and we also have immune system cells in this area as well. We have medullary sinuses, which are just open spaces in the medulla, so they would be analogous to the subcapsular sinuses, and they're continuous with the subcapsular sinuses. So if you're lymph, you have to come in, move through a subcapsular sinus, into the medulla, move through a medullary sinus, kind of avoid these areas of solid tissue, again in purple here, in the medulla, which are known as medullary cords, as you're making your way out of the lymph node. So there isn't a straight shot for lymph. It can't just quickly move from one side of the lymph node to the other. It actually has to go through kind of this maze, if you will, of sinuses through the lymph node, and that's going to help to further slow down the lymph. So we've got this congestion that's going on, but we've also got this slowdown that's happening because we've got this maze of sinuses that the lymph actually has to move through, and that's going to give the immune system cells that are in the lymph node even more time to kind of observe the lymph as it's going through and remove substances from the lymph that could potentially be harmful. There's one other thing that I want to mention as I'm talking about the structure of this to kind of help you understand how a lymph node is actually filtering. So if you look in these subcapsular sinuses and also in these medullary sinuses as well, you may notice if you look closely that we have these little black streaks, okay, that are kind of spanning. They're attached to the wall of the sinus, and then they're attached also to the follicle over on the other side. So I'm going to draw a few in just in case you're having a hard time seeing them. So you've got these little fibers. These are actually reticular fibers. So you learned about those in 227, and they're spanning the sinuses. They are known as stroma. So you might sometimes hear them referred to as reticular fibers, or you might hear them called stroma, which is their actual name. And the role of these fibers, these stroma that span the sinuses, is they provide a place for immune system cells such as macrophages to hold onto, okay? So they provide basically an anchor for macrophages so that as lymph is moving into the lymph node, and remember, lymph is a fluid, it's moving through these sinuses and eventually out the other side, these macrophages can kind of hold onto the stroma and they can watch the lymph as it's flowing by. And if they see a bacterium or something else that shouldn't be there, they can actually grab onto that bacterium and then phagocytize it. If we didn't have these stroma present, these little tiny black circles in the sinuses are representing the immune system cells. They are teeny tiny. They would get picked up by the lymph and they would just get flushed out of the lymph node, and then you wouldn't have them kind of resident in a lymph node. So these stroma provide an anchoring site for these immune system cells to hold on to so that they don't get picked up and carried away by the lymph as lymph is making its way through the lymph node, but instead they can stay in place and they can remove from the lymph things that shouldn't be there so that that lymph doesn't take that bacteria, the viruses, whatever it is, and deposit it into the blood.